Welcome to the Christian Business Concepts with your host, Harold Milby. Christian Business Concepts is dedicated to guiding companies and business owners in becoming effective, efficient, and successful through God's Word and godly principles. Now, here's your host, Harold Milby.
Thanks, Kelly, and welcome everyone to another Christian Business Concepts podcast. I'm your host, Harold Milby, and I'm so glad that you decided to download and listen to this episode. Did you know that there's a direct correlation between learning and growing and confidence? The more we grow, the more confidence we gain. And I'm truly humbled by the thousands of you who make CBC a part of your growth journey each week. And I hope that you're encouraged, and I hope you're enlightened and empowered by what you hear today. That's my prayer. I hope that you are. So I'm going to ask you to do me a great favor, though. Would you be willing to share today's podcast with, say, 4 or 5 other people that you think would be helped by listening to this? And also, if you would be so kind as to post a link to this podcast on your Facebook and LinkedIn pages. I would greatly appreciate that. And that'll help us to grow the CBC podcast. So greatly appreciate that. And I'm so thankful that you're doing the work and helping us to grow the podcast. So thank you so much. And we appreciate everything that you're doing to help us do that. Now, today I want to give a big shout out to the country of Bangladesh. I think this is the first time that they have shown up with regards to downloading some of the podcasts. And so Bangladesh is there. They're in between kind of India and Burma and on the other side of the world from the U.S., but we appreciate you there in Bangladesh. Thank you so much for being a part. We hope that you're blessed by this podcast and that you'll come back and make us a part of your day or your weekly growth program for you as a person in your career and your professional life. So I hope this podcast is a blessing to you and that you'll keep finding true godly success through the biblical principles that we discuss each week. So keep up the good work there in Bangladesh and around the world, all of you around the world who download and are a part of the CBC family. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to study and learn about great leaders. I've read lots of books. I'm an avid reader, and I've read many books by Christian business leaders, by non-Christian business leaders. I've read a lot. I've taken a lot of notes. I've learned a lot from people. I've been to seminars, and you name it. Everything and anything I could do to grow. And what I have found was that most very successful leaders had what I would consider to be a kind of weekly cadence of what they did. Now, this cadence was made up of like really good habits, some really good systems and processes that they have developed in their lives. And this cadence is the foundation, really, of their weekly effectiveness and their weekly success. You see, most leaders don't lack effort. Most leaders put in the effort, but they lack a certain rhythm. They start Monday very reactive, they reacting to things, and then they sprint through a bunch of meetings, and then they solve what screams they hear. And then they collapse into Friday. And then they do it all over again, right? So that's not really leadership. It's certainly not biblical leadership. That's what I would consider to be more reactive management, kind of what I've called before a whack-a-mole management style. And that's not a good management strategy. And understand this, God is not a God of chaos. The Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 14:33, it says, "For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace." And if God leads with order, structure, rhythm, I think us as leaders and as people, we should do the same. Your organization is already following your cadence. Whether you've designed it or not, they're following your cadence. You know, when you look at it and you see, you look at the world. God built the world on rhythm. Before there was business, there was already a cadence. There was already a rhythm. Genesis 1 shows us something very profound, because God could have created everything just instantly, could have created it all, but he didn't. He created things in sequence, day by day, evening and morning. He had order. There was structure. There was rhythm. And then he rested on the seventh day. Genesis 2:2 says, by the seventh day, God had finished the work. So on the seventh day, he rested. Rest was not recovery for God. God didn't need to recover from all the work that he had done in the first 6 days when he completed creation. But that rest was part of a rhythm. From the beginning, heaven has operated on a cadence. So the question is not, do I have a rhythm? The question is my rhythm intentional? Because you've got a rhythm. But is it intentional? The ideal weekly structure, what you're trying to do with it, you want to design and create a drumbeat. Every great organization, every great enterprise runs on a rhythm. It's just like your heart. Your heart has a beat. It's got a rhythm. The ocean has tides. It's got a rhythm. The seasons have cycles. They've got a rhythm. And even elite athletes train in a structured way. But many leaders run their companies on interruption, if I can say it that way. Peter Drucker, famous leadership guy, written a lot of books on leadership, management, sales. And he said this, he said, efficiency is doing things right, but effectiveness is doing the right things. And when you have a weekly leadership rhythm, it ensures that you're doing the right things, not just reacting efficiently, but you're actually doing the right things. So here's a great myth that we need to understand in business. And that myth is this: speed equals success. Modern culture says, move fast. You got to decide quickly. Seize every opportunity. Don't miss the window. But Scripture repeatedly shows leaders who slowed down to seek God before acting. Joshua did not march around Jericho just randomly. He followed some very precise instructions. Nehemiah didn't rebuild the wall emotionally. He assessed. He got there. He went out at night when nobody was around, and he assessed the damage very privately, very quietly at first. Jesus himself regularly withdrew to pray before a lot of major decisions. Even the Son of God refused to be rushed. And if Jesus needed rhythm, we definitely do, for sure. So what we want is a simple, ideal weekly leadership structure. Now, what I'm getting ready to share with you is very detailed, and I think that as a business, every business is different. Every size of business is different. And maybe you're a single, one-man operation at this point, or maybe you've got 100 employees, but anywhere in between. So when we talk about these details today, about this rhythm for a weekly rhythm that you should have, keep in mind that everything may not fit for you, but take what you can, use what you can to develop your own weekly rhythm. So let's get started. So we got to talk about Monday. Monday's the first day of the week, right? So Monday should be your direction day, okay? That's the day. You should set some weekly priorities, because most leaders don't fail because they choose the wrong things. They fail because they choose too many things. It's hard to actually have priorities when you have 15 or 20 different things. It's really hard. Everything becomes urgent, and there's nothing that's strategic. So what you want to do is you want to choose 3 to 5 very critical outcomes that you need for that week. I'm not talking about tasks. I'm talking about outcomes, not, send a proposal or have a meeting or work on marketing. No, we're talking about outcomes. You should hear yourself be saying, well, I need to secure this signed contract with, ABC company, or launch a revised pricing model. Those are outcomes. Hire an operations manager. That's an outcome. Priorities answer this question. If only these things get done this week, would we still call it progress? That's the question to ask. Nehemiah rebuilt the wall, not the entire city. He chose, to narrow it down to what he knew he could do, what was so very, very important. So leaders who try to do everything typically accomplish nothing that really matters. So keep that in mind. Another thing you do on Monday, you align these key outcomes. You make sure everyone's pulling in the same direction. Amos 3:3 says, "Can two walk together unless they be agreed?" So even a small misalignment, it can compound really, really quickly. And what does this alignment look like? Everyone knows or should know the top 3 to 5 outcomes you have for the week, and everybody understands how their role connects to that, and everybody knows what not to focus on. Because when you don't have alignment, you got marketing pushing in one direction, sales is pushing in another direction, operations are protecting something else, and leadership assumes that there is some clarity when there really isn't. So alignment really requires verbal reinforcement. Moses repeatedly reminded Israel of the mission and the covenant, because drift, what we call, and most people in business understand, but drift is natural. It happens unless you keep an eye on things. So practically what you need to do is ask in your Monday meeting, who owns this outcome? So if you've got these 3 to 5 outcomes, you need to know who's going to be the owner of that outcome. You need to know and answer the question of, what does success look like this week? What resources are going to be required? And then look ahead. What could derail us? What could cause us to get off the tracks here? So alignment eliminates silent assumptions. A lot of people assume things when they don't know. They draw their own conclusions. If you have a rowing team in the Olympics, it loses speed when everybody is not rowing, and they're not rowing in sync, and they're not rowing in the same direction. So it's important that we get alignment. Another thing that you do on Mondays, you communicate that focus to your team, right? Because you don't want any uncertainty. When people don't know what matters most, they just go back to what screams the loudest. Philippians 2:2 urges us as believers to be, as it says, of the same mind, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Intent requires repetition. Monday communication should answer these questions. What matters most this week? What's secondary? What can wait? And where must we be disciplined? So very, very important that we look at these things. Another thing that you do on Mondays, you clarify what winning looks like for this week. What's it going to look like to win this week? Because too many leaders wait until Friday to decide whether the week was successful or not. But if you're going to be winning, if you're going to be a winner, you've got to define that before the execution begins. That's why I like Habakkuk 2:2. It says, write the vision and make it plain. We need to make that plain. What does that look like this week? If success is not written, if it's not spoken, it just becomes subjective to what everybody else thinks. And what kind of measurable outcomes defines a win? What milestones matter? What conversations need to happen? What decisions have got to be made? Winning may not always mean revenue. Sometimes winning means solving a problem. It means repairing a culture. It means removing a bottleneck, or saying no to an opportunity, but it's not in alignment, so we have to say no. Because that's what I think is important. Now, let's look at Tuesday and Wednesday. Tuesday and Wednesday should be the deep work. That's when movement takes place. That's when you build what actually moves the needle. That's what moves the needle. These are your building days. So it shouldn't be about babysitting, and you know what I mean. It shouldn't be about interruption. It shouldn't be about, well, let's just see what pops up. That's not what Tuesday and Wednesday should be. Tuesday and Wednesday should be about building. Because there's a time and season to everything. In fact, the Word of God says that in Ecclesiastes 3:1. There's a time for everything, a time to plant, a time to uproot, and a time to harvest. So Tuesday and Wednesday are like planting days, but you got to protect them. You got to be very aggressive about protecting them. This should be about strategic initiatives. Strategic work is not maintenance. That's what moves the needle. So this includes stuff like new product and service development, maybe some market expansion ideas that you have, or systems improvement, or long-term partnerships, or even process automation. I'm a big believer in trying to automate as much process as you can. Nehemiah didn't just go in there and patch up a bunch of holes. He rebuilt a whole infrastructure. So strategic initiatives answer, where do we need to be in 6 to 12 months? What do we got to do now to get there? And even most small businesses, they kind of stall out because they never leave what I call operational survival mode. They're just trying to operate the business. So if you only harvest but you never plant, then the next season you're not going to have anything to eat. I mean, it's just that simple. Strategy is planting seeds that your future really depends on. Tuesdays or Wednesdays should also be high impact projects days, that 80-20 leadership, because not all work is equal. Jesus ministered to thousands of people, but he invested very deeply in just 12. That was leverage. And maybe you've got some high impact projects like remove some bottlenecks, unlock some scalability, solve some root problems, whatever they may be. And then you got to ask yourself, ask things like, if this gets done, what becomes easier? If I can get this done, does it make something else easier? If this, or maybe you can ask this question, if this doesn't get done, what remains stuck? What doesn't move forward? What doesn't move the needle? Proverbs 21:5 says, the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance. So diligence means focusing, and focusing on as much leverage as you have, not volume, but leverage. Busy multiplies activity, but focus multiplies results. Let me say it again. Being busy multiplies your activities, but being focused multiplies your results. The next thing that you need to do on Tuesdays and Wednesdays is that should be client development. That should be customer development. Revenue follows relationship. Jesus built trust before he called people to follow him. And so your client development, your customer development should be and include strategic outreach, maybe some follow-ups, nurturing those relationships, strengthening a lot of those long-term partnerships, and increasing the value, but more importantly, the lifetime value. See, many leaders hide behind internal work because external engagement, and I'm talking about, again, client development, customer development, it just doesn't feel comfortable for them. They don't like doing it, so they just keep themselves busy with other stuff so they don't have to. But it's important and it's strategic. If you don't have any clients, you don't have a mission. It's that important. Luke 16:10 reminds us that whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. So, you've got to steward even those small accounts. You need to put a lot of energy into them and to continue to raise them up and develop them as a customer. See, growth always follows faithfulness. So growth follows faithfulness. Growth is very relational. It's very, very relational. And then the other thing you need to be looking at is your revenue-driving activities. So what are those? Well, Christian business leaders say sometimes they spiritualize their vision, but they don't really look at the economics. Revenue is not greed. It's oxygen. Revenue drives activities that may include things like sales calls, proposals, marketing launches, pricing adjustments, strategic partnerships. Paul worked as a tent maker to sustain his ministry. He didn't despise economics. He just was a good steward of it. A ministry even without funding is a vision without fuel. So you got to protect Tuesday and Wednesday because that's revenue time. So you got to make sure that you do that. All right, let's look at Thursday. Thursday, collaboration and culture. Collaboration and culture. If Tuesday builds output, Thursday builds people. An organization is not just a machine. It's a body that's made up of people. Paul describes the church as one body in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And bodies require coordination. So you've got to have that, on Thursday. And so you have to have that. It's time for collaboration. And that's so important to us. And then Thursday should also be team check-ins. You should have your team checking in, right? So consistency builds safety. In other words, a simple rhythm is like your wins, your metrics that you're trying to study and watch, any obstacles, any priorities. That's so important because irregular leadership creates this very organizational kind of a vertigo. So you want to make sure that you've got these folks that are checking in with you and letting you know how things are going. Then there's development conversations. Jesus constantly developed his disciples. He corrected them, he instructed them, he commissioned them, sent them out. These types of conversations, are things like, strength feedback, growing skills, helping them to grow skills, leadership grooming, character shaping. If you only manage output, you really weaken capacity with people. Ephesians 4:12 says, reminds us, the leaders to equip others for the works of service. Equipping people multiplies the impact. When you sharpen people, you sharpen the mission. So that's important. And you should always have alignment meetings too, because sometimes you have to recalibrate things, but you should have alignment meetings on Thursdays, and that kind of prevents a lot of fragmentation. You can ask those questions like, are we still focused on the same outcomes? Has anything shifted this week? Or are everybody's roles still very clear in what they're to be doing? Amos 3:3 said, can two walk together unless they be agreed? Alignment meetings protect the unity within the organization. And unity is a multiplying force. It multiplies, and it's a powerful force, but you need to know the importance of this unity. And then you should have some problem-solving sessions as well. These are service level, fixes that create a lot of reoccurring headaches, and you need to address those. Jesus addressed root causes. He didn't just deal with symptoms. He got down to the root cause, because problem solving requires a very honest dialogue, a lot of data, some very good analysis, and then ownership. Somebody's got to own it. Proverbs 18:13 says and warns us and says, to answer before listening is folly. Listen fully before solving. Unaddressed problems, unaddressed friction, it just compounds and makes things a lot worse. And then we come to Friday. And Friday should be a time of review and refinement. It should be a time that we're protecting the mission and making sure that we're doing that. Friday is really where leaders matter. Without reviewing, the weeks kind of blur together, but when you have review, you get to compound. It just has a compounding effect. So what do we need to do on that Friday? Well, you need to measure your progress. Inspect what you expect. Inspect what you expect. Even God, he said in Genesis, said he saw that it was good. Measurement clarifies a lot of things. And you need to ask, did we hit the defined wins that we started out with on Monday? What moved the needle? What metrics shifted? What things changed? You can't steward what you refuse to measure. You have to measure certain things. We talk about KPIs, key performance indicators. Know what those are and see, did they move the needle this week? You can't be a good steward on anything that you refuse to measure. So you want to do that. And then the next thing you want to do is you want to evaluate any kind of wins or losses or misses. That's just part of normal learning. You need to celebrate the wins, and you need to do that intentionally. Don't just make it a haphazard thing, but make it a big deal, because it is a big deal. And, God praised God publicly for the victories that he had. But also make sure that you examine the mistakes, the misses, without shame. Romans 8:28 reminds us God works all things together for good, but reflection extracts wisdom. So you have to reflect on it. Failure reviewed becomes wisdom, and failure ignored becomes a pattern. So it's very important that we evaluate the wins and the losses. And then the other thing that we do on Friday is identify the bottlenecks. Find out what's constraining, what's causing us not to move the needle. And every system has a constraint. It may be a person, it may be a process, it may be a communication gap, a tool, a leadership blind spot, could be any number of things. But you have to identify those bottlenecks. Exodus 18 shows us that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, identified Moses himself as the bottleneck. And sometimes the constraint is not the employees, it's the leader. And for a leader to recognize that is really kind of, humility at work. You can say that. And on Friday, you need to plan next week. Plan it at a really high level. You want to protect Monday before it ever gets here. So don't walk into Monday unprepared. On Friday, maybe you should sketch some things out, like for Monday, like what are the 3 to 5 top priorities you think that Monday's going to hold for the week. Maybe think about some upcoming decisions that you need to make. Maybe there's a critical meeting on Monday, or there's some anticipated challenges. Proverbs 16:9 says, in their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. You can't improve what you do not inspect. You have to inspect things, because you can't improve upon them if you don't. And you got to make sure you got some thinking time. The most neglected discipline in leadership, they don't have any thinking time. The greatest leaders in the history built thinking time into their cadence, into their rhythm. Bill Gates famously used to schedule what he called think weeks, where he disconnected to read and reflect. Warren Buffett actually spends the majority of his day reading and thinking. Yet a lot of modern leaders, they brag about being busy and having back-to-back meetings all the time. But busyness is not being brave. Busy sometimes is just trying to avoid others and other things. So if you don't think on purpose, you'll decide things on emotion in many cases. So you got to make sure you're protecting your weekly thinking blocks. At a minimum, you should schedule 90 minutes to 2 hours per week of just thinking time, with no meetings, no phone, no email, no interruptions. It's not really luxury, okay, folks? To do that is what leaders do. And during that thinking time, you ought to be asking yourself, well, what am I missing? What's the real constraint here that we have? What problem is hiding behind this problem? And if we're starting today, would we still do it this way? So you got to ask yourself those questions on Fridays. It's kind of like a lumberjack who maybe never sharpens his axe. And every day that he doesn't sharpen his axe, he just works harder and harder and produces less and less. So thinking time is how you sharpen the blade, if I can say it that way. If you're too busy to think, you're too busy to lead. That's simple. So what's the cost of no rhythm? Well, if you don't have a rhythm, if you don't have a cadence every week, it's like, the loudest voice wins. There's a lot of emotional decisions that are made. There's strategic drift that begins to accelerate, and leaders begin to get burnout. This whack-a-mole leadership feels really productive because you're hitting something, but it's not. It doesn't. It rewards reflex, not wisdom. It rewards speed, not strategy, and it rewards reaction, not direction. See, the absence of rhythm is the presence of chaos. So a weekly rhythm says we think, we measure, we improve, we communicate, and we lead on purpose. Because it transforms our leadership from improvisation to more of an orchestration. So here's the final challenge. Stop swinging at everything that moves. Design your week before your week designs you. Build thinking times, install review rhythms, protect your strategic days, and strengthen your team check-ins. Because whack-a-mole, it's exhausting. But cadence and rhythm, it's empowering. And in leadership, rhythm beats intensity every single time. Lord, thank you for all of the leaders and managers and people who have listened to this podcast today. Lord, help us to apply these principles and concepts in our professional endeavors, Lord, and in order for each of us to become more productive, more efficient, and more effective in the businesses and organizations and departments that we're over, that we're responsible for, that you've given us that responsibility for. Lord, help us each, Lord, to be good stewards over what you've given us. Help us, Lord, to help us to find that today's discussion is going to help us to find true godly success. And Lord, I thank you for that, and I praise you for it in Jesus' name. Well, thank you again for downloading and listening to today's Christian Business Concepts podcast. Thank you so much. And let's be people who change the world around us as God's people. And let us add value to people that makes a positive difference in people's lives. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So remember, until next time, Jesus is Lord, and He wants you blessed.
Thank you for tuning into this week's Christian Business Concepts podcast. Go to ChristianBusinessConcepts.com for more information and resources. Be sure to check out other podcasts that will help you take your business and your personal life to a whole new level of success.